there are people who no longer fit into the rhythm of the world. Not because they've failed, not because they lack ambition or social skills, but because something within them has shifted. They've begun to see the machinery beneath the surface. They've started to hear the silence between the noise. And once you perceive what most choose to ignore, returning to the dance becomes almost impossible. You've probably met them. They're the ones who pause before speaking, who listen with an intensity that makes others uncomfortable, who ask questions that don't have easy answers. They're often labeled as overthinking, too sensitive, withdrawn. But what's really happening is something far more profound. They're not retreating from life. They're retreating from a particular version of life that no longer feels authentic to them. And this withdrawal isn't weakness. It's a response to something the German philosopher Martin Heidegger spent his lifetime trying to articulate. The tension between authentic existence and what he called das Man, the anonymous they, that dictates how we should live, think, and be. The mindful person begins to notice this they everywhere. They notice it in conversations that follow predictable patterns, where nothing real is ever said. They notice it in social gatherings where everyone performs an agreed-upon role. They notice it in the workplace, where productivity has become divorced from meaning. And most painfully, they notice it within themselves. The countless ways they've shaped their existence to meet invisible expectations they never consciously chose. This awareness doesn't arrive as a sudden revelation. It creeps in slowly, through 1,000 small observations. Perhaps you're sitting at dinner with friends, and suddenly you realize you're not actually present. You're watching yourself play the part of someone at dinner with friends. Or you're scrolling through social media, and you catch yourself curating an identity that bears only a vague resemblance to your inner experience. Or you're at work, completing tasks that contribute to goals you've never examined, wondering when your life became this sequence of automated responses to external demands. Heidegger called this mode of existence inauthenticity, not as moral judgment, but as a description of a life lived according to others' blueprints. And here's the paradox that haunts the mindful person. The moment you become aware of this inauthenticity, you cannot unsee it. The comfort of unconscious participation is gone. But the alternative, authentic existence, requires something most people find unbearable. It requires standing alone in your decisions, facing the anxiety of your own freedom, accepting responsibility for creating meaning in a world that offers no guaranteed significance. So the mindful person begins to withdraw. Not all at once, not dramatically, but incrementally, in ways both visible and invisible. They decline invitations to gatherings that feel hollow. They reduce their presence on platforms designed to commodify attention. They distance themselves from conversations that circle endlessly without depth. And from the outside, this withdrawal can appear antisocial, depressive, even arrogant. But from the inside, it feels like the only honest response available. How do you participate in a game whose rules you can no longer accept? How do you engage authentically with a world structured around inauthenticity? The philosopher understood this tension intimately. He wrote about thrownness, the fact that we find ourselves already embedded in a world we didn't choose, already interpreting existence through concepts and frameworks given to us before we could question them. We're thrown into a particular time, a particular culture, a particular web of meanings. And most people never question this inheritance. They accept the ready-made interpretations of what matters, what's valuable, what constitutes a good life. But the mindful person cannot accept these interpretations without examination. And examination inevitably reveals the cracks. You start to see how much of what we call normal life is actually collective distraction. The endless consumption, the frantic busyness, the addiction to stimulation, all of it serves to keep us from facing fundamental questions about existence, death, meaning, and our own responsibility for the shape of our lives. We fill our days with noise because silence is terrifying. We fill our minds with others' thoughts because our own thoughts lead to uncomfortable places. We fill our time with prescribed activities because unstructured time forces us to confront the question Heidegger considered central to human existence. What does it mean to be? The mindful person has stopped running from this question, and this is precisely what makes their continued participation in ordinary social life so difficult. How do you make small talk when you're carrying around questions about the nature of being? How do you care about status competitions when you've glimpsed the arbitrary nature of all social hierarchies? How do you invest energy in acquiring things when you've recognized that no object can fill the existential void that drives most consumption? There's a particular loneliness that comes with this awareness. You're surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone in your experience. You watch others move through life with apparent ease, and you wonder what you've lost, or perhaps what you never had. The ability to not think so much. The gift of easy belonging. The comfort of accepting answers rather than living questions. And there are moments when you'd give anything to return to that unconscious participation, to unsee what you've seen, to forget what you've learned about the constructed nature of meaning. But here's what Heidegger understood, and what the mindful person is slowly discovering. You cannot go backwards. Once consciousness shifts, once authentic questioning begins, the old comforts lose their power to comfort. You can pretend, you can perform participation, but you cannot genuinely return to the innocence of unconscious existence. And this irreversibility is both the burden and the liberation of awakening. The withdrawal, then, isn't simply about avoiding discomfort. It's about creating space for something else to emerge. The mindful person is withdrawing from one mode of existence to make room for another. They're stepping back from the collective performance to discover what remains when the performance stops. And this requires solitude. Not the loneliness of unwanted isolation, but the deliberate solitude necessary for authentic self-discovery. In solitude, away from the constant noise of collective opinion, you can begin to hear your own voice. You can start to distinguish between what you genuinely care about and what you've been conditioned to care about. You can examine your choices without the distortion of others' expectations. You can feel your feelings without immediately translating them into socially acceptable narratives. This is the space where authentic existence becomes possible, not as a final destination, but as an ongoing practice of self-creation. Heidegger called this resoluteness, the courageous acceptance of your own finitude and freedom. The mindful person is learning resoluteness through their withdrawal. They're learning that they cannot outsource the responsibility for their existence to society's templates. They're learning that meaning must be created, not discovered. They're learning that authenticity isn't a state you achieve, but a direction you move toward, perpetually, knowing you'll never fully arrive. And this is where the withdrawal transforms from escape into engagement. The mindful person isn't rejecting the world. They're rejecting a particular way of being in the world. They're not antisocial. They're seeking forms of relation that honor depth, truth, and genuine presence. They're not depressed about life. They're grieving the loss of comforting illusions while simultaneously awakening to richer possibilities. This distinction matters enormously, because society often interprets withdrawal as failure, when in reality, it may be the beginning of a more authentic form of success. The success of living according to values you've chosen rather than inherited. The success of relationships based on genuine recognition rather than mutual performance. The success of work that emerges from inner necessity rather than external pressure. The success of a life that, however small or unconventional, feels true. But let's be honest about the cost. This path is difficult. The mindful person lives with a tension that those immersed in collective life rarely experience. They must navigate a world structured around values they don't fully accept, while trying to live according to principles they're still discovering. They must engage in practical necessity, earning money, maintaining relationships, fulfilling obligations, while simultaneously questioning the frameworks that make these necessities necessary. They must be in the world, but not entirely of it. And this double consciousness is exhausting. There are days when the mindful person envies the unreflective, when they watch someone enthusiastically pursuing conventional success and wonder what secret that person possesses. The secret of wholehearted investment in questionable goals. The secret of certainty in an uncertain world. The secret of belonging without reservation. And in these moments, the withdrawal feels less like wisdom and more like exile. Yet something prevents them from abandoning their path. Perhaps it's integrity, the inability to live a lie once the truth has been glimpsed. Perhaps it's curiosity, the need to discover what exists beyond the comfortable illusions. Perhaps it's simply how they're built, unable to ignore what they perceive, even when perception brings more questions than answers. Whatever the source, the mindful person continues their withdrawal, continues their questioning, continues their attempt to live authentically in an inauthentic world. And gradually, something unexpected happens. The withdrawal, which began as a reaction against falseness, becomes an action toward truth. The space created by stepping back begins to fill with something new. Not answers exactly, not solutions to the fundamental questions, but a different quality of being, a presence that's less reactive, less desperate, less dependent on external validation. The mindful person discovers that withdrawal has given them something precious: the ability to be with themselves, to sit in uncertainty without immediately reaching for distraction, to feel the full weight of existence without collapsing under it. Heidegger wrote about being toward death, the recognition that our existence is finite, and that this finitude gives meaning and urgency to our choices. The mindful person, in their withdrawal, is practicing this recognition. They're living with the awareness that time is limited, that every choice forecloses other possibilities, that the responsibility for their existence cannot be delegated. And while this awareness brings anxiety, the anxiety of freedom that Heidegger considered fundamental to authentic existence, it also brings clarity. When you know your time is limited, trivial concerns lose their power. When you recognize your freedom, others' opinions become less determining. When you accept responsibility for creating meaning, the absence of predetermined significance becomes liberating rather than terrifying. The mindful person is slowly learning to transform existential anxiety into existential courage. The courage to be uncertain, the courage to stand alone, the courage to live questions rather than demand answers. This doesn't mean they've achieved some state of permanent wisdom. They still struggle, they still doubt, they still feel the pull of easier paths. But they're developing a different relationship with struggle. Instead of seeing their difficulties as signs they've gone wrong, they're beginning to understand them as inherent to the path they've chosen. Authentic existence isn't supposed to be easy. It's supposed to be real. There's a specific moment that many mindful people experience during this withdrawal, a moment of profound stillness where the constant mental noise finally subsides. It often happens unexpectedly. You're sitting alone, perhaps at dawn or late at night, and suddenly you notice the absence of something. The absence of the need to be anywhere else. The absence of the compulsion to check, to scroll, to distract. The absence of the voice that constantly evaluates and judges your experience. And in this absence, something else appears. A simple presence. A being here now that asks nothing of you except that you remain open to it. This is what the mindful person has been searching for, though they might not have known it. Not some grand revelation or mystical experience, but this quiet capacity to be present to existence without immediately trying to interpret it, fix it, or escape from it. It's a subtle shift, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But once you've experienced it, you understand why all the withdrawal was necessary. You needed to clear away the accumulated debris of collective distraction to make space for this simple, profound presence. Heidegger wrote about dwelling, the idea that authentic existence involves learning to inhabit the world in a way that honors both its mystery and its ordinariness. The mindful person, through their withdrawal, is learning to dwell. Not to conquer or consume or constantly improve, but to be with what is. To let things be what they are. To encounter existence without the filter of endless interpretation and judgment. This capacity for dwelling transforms their relationship with time. In the world of collective distraction, time is always scarce. There's never enough. You're always behind, always rushing, always anxious about what you haven't yet accomplished. But in dwelling, time reveals a different quality. Not as something to be filled or conquered, but as the medium through which presence unfolds. The mindful person discovers that they don't need more time. They need to be more fully present to the time they have. And this presence changes everything. It changes how they listen to others, not planning their response while the other person speaks, but actually hearing what's being said beneath the words. It changes how they move through space, not rushing from task to task, but sensing the texture of each moment. It changes how they experience their own thoughts and emotions, not identifying with every mental movement, but observing the arising and passing of inner weather with curiosity rather than reactivity. This is the freedom that Heidegger pointed toward, not freedom from external constraints. Those will always exist. But freedom within existence itself. The freedom to be present rather than perpetually absent. The freedom to choose your response rather than automatically react. The freedom to create meaning rather than passively accept inherited interpretations. This freedom is what the mindful person has been seeking through their withdrawal. And slowly, painfully, courageously, they're beginning to find it. But let's not romanticize this journey. the mindful person still faces the practical challenges of living in a world that doesn't value consciousness. They still need to earn money in economic systems designed around unconscious consumption. They still navigate social expectations that reward performance over authenticity. They still encounter the pain of misunderstanding from those who interpret their withdrawal as rejection. The gap between their inner experience and the external world remains wide, and bridging it requires constant creative effort. There are moments when this gap feels unbearable. When the mindful person wishes they could simply explain to others what they see, why they've chosen to step back, why the old ways no longer work for them. But they're learning that authentic understanding cannot be transmitted through explanation. It emerges through experience. You cannot convince someone to wake up. You can only demonstrate through your own life that another way of being is possible. And even then, most people won't understand. They'll see the surface, the withdrawal, the solitude, the rejection of convention, without perceiving the deeper movement toward authenticity. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of the mindful person's journey. That you cannot save others from their sleep. That consciousness cannot be given, only chosen. That each person must make their own journey from inauthenticity to authenticity, and no one can make it for them. The mindful person learns to release the burden of awakening others. Not out of indifference, but out of respect for each person's sovereignty over their own existence. They learn to live their truth quietly, without evangelizing, trusting that their example will speak to those ready to hear it. And slowly, very slowly, they notice something else. Other people are noticing them. Not everyone, not the majority. But here and there, someone recognizes something in the mindful person's presence. A quality of genuineness, an absence of pretense, a willingness to engage with depth. And these recognitions create the possibility of genuine connection. Not the broad, shallow network of conventional social life, but deeper, more honest relationships with those who are also questioning, also withdrawing, also seeking authentic ways of being. These connections are different. They're not based on shared activities or mutual performance. They're based on shared recognition. The recognition of others who are also trying to live consciously in an unconscious world. And in these connections, the mindful person finds that they're not as alone as they thought. That withdrawal from the collective doesn't mean isolation from humanity. That stepping back from one form of belonging can open space for another, truer form. When two mindful people meet, something remarkable happens. The usual dance of social interaction, the posturing, the small talk, the careful performance of acceptable personhood, becomes unnecessary. They can speak from a deeper place. They can share their uncertainties without shame. They can explore questions without needing to arrive at comfortable answers. They can sit in silence without awkwardness, because they understand that presence doesn't always require words. These relationships become sanctuaries, small islands of authenticity in a sea of performance, and they validate the entire difficult journey of withdrawal. They prove that stepping back from collective illusion doesn't condemn you to permanent solitude. It actually makes genuine connection possible in a way it wasn't before. Because you're no longer connecting mask to mask, but being to being. You're meeting not as social actors playing predetermined roles, but as conscious individuals navigating the same fundamental challenges of existence. The mindful person also begins to develop a different relationship with their own emotions. In the world of collective distraction, difficult emotions are problems to be fixed. Sadness means something's wrong. Anxiety must be eliminated. Anger should be suppressed. But in their withdrawal, the mindful person has time and space to sit with these emotional states without immediately trying to change them. And in this sitting, they discover something unexpected. Emotions are not problems, they're information. They're the body's way of responding to existence, and each emotion carries important data about how we're relating to ourselves and our world. The mindful person learns to welcome their emotions as guests, even the uncomfortable ones. They learn that sadness often carries wisdom about what truly matters. That anxiety reveals where we're living inauthentically. That anger shows us where our boundaries have been violated. These emotions aren't obstacles to authentic living. They're essential components of it. This emotional awareness deepens their withdrawal in some ways, because they become even more sensitive to the emotional violence of conventional social life. They notice how much of ordinary interaction involves emotional manipulation, emotional suppression, and emotional dishonesty. They feel the weight of unspoken feelings in rooms full of polite conversation. They sense the collective anxiety beneath the surface performance of normalcy. And this sensitivity makes sustained engagement with unconscious social environments increasingly difficult. But it also gives them a kind of superpower: the ability to be emotionally present without being emotionally reactive, the capacity to feel deeply without being overwhelmed, the skill of holding space for others' emotions without trying to fix or change them. The mindful person becomes a kind of emotional anchor, someone who can remain present and grounded even when those around them are caught in reactive patterns. This isn't about being unaffected or detached. It's about having done enough inner work that you can meet intensity without adding to it. This is the transformation that makes the withdrawal worthwhile. The mindful person isn't abandoning human connection. They're seeking connection at a different frequency. They're looking for others who are also willing to question, to be uncertain, to live without the comfort of collective delusion. And when these connections form, they validate the entire difficult journey. They prove that authenticity, while rare, isn't impossible. That depth, while demanding, isn't pointless. That consciousness, while painful, ultimately enriches, rather than diminishes life. Heidegger believed that authenticity wasn't about finding yourself, but about creating yourself through conscious choice and committed action. The mindful person, through their withdrawal, is engaged in exactly this creation. They're not looking for a pre-existing self to discover. They're actively constructing a way of being that honors their perceptions, their values, their deepest sense of what matters. This is frightening work. It offers no guarantees. It promises no happy endings. But it offers something perhaps more valuable than happiness. It offers reality. This process of self-creation involves constant negotiation. The mindful person must decide, again and again, which aspects of conventional life they can participate in authentically and which they must refuse. Where can they engage without compromising their integrity? Where must they withdraw to preserve their consciousness? These aren't questions with permanent answers. The boundaries shift as they grow, as circumstances change, as their understanding deepens. Living authentically is not about following a fixed set of rules. It's about maintaining an ongoing dialogue between your inner truth and the external demands of existence. Some days, the mindful person finds ways to bridge the gap. They discover pockets of authenticity within conventional structures. A genuine conversation at a superficial event. A moment of real presence in a transactional workplace. A flash of truth in a relationship built on performance. These moments remind them that authenticity isn't an all-or-nothing proposition. It's a direction, a tendency, a practice that can be cultivated even in inhospitable environments. Other days, the gap feels impossibly wide. The mindful person encounters situations where no authentic response seems possible, where every option requires some form of self-betrayal, where the price of participation is higher than they can pay. In these moments, withdrawal is not a choice but a necessity, a form of self-preservation. A refusal to abandon themselves in order to accommodate a world that has no room for their truth. The philosopher spoke of thrownness. We are thrown into existence without choosing it, into circumstances we didn't select, with possibilities we didn't determine. The mindful person is learning to work with this thrownness rather than against it. They're accepting that they cannot change the fundamental structure of the world they've been thrown into. But they can change their relationship to it. They can refuse to let the world's unconsciousness become their own. They can create small spaces of consciousness within the larger unconscious structure. They can live as islands of awareness in an ocean of distraction. And maybe this is enough. Maybe the mindful person's contribution isn't to transform society or wake the masses. Maybe it's simply to keep consciousness alive, to demonstrate through their own existence that another way is possible, to serve as a reminder that depth still exists, that questions still matter, that authentic being remains an option even when the whole world seems to have chosen otherwise. This is humble work. It doesn't come with recognition or reward. It often goes unnoticed or misunderstood, but it matters. Because every person who chooses consciousness over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, depth over distraction, helps to keep these possibilities alive in the world. They become living proof that the human spirit cannot be entirely reduced to economic function or social performance. That something in us resists total absorption into the machinery of collective unconsciousness. And maybe this is the real reason mindful people are withdrawing from society. Not because they can't handle it. Not because they're weak or antisocial or depressed. but because they've caught a glimpse of something beyond the performance. Something more real, more honest, more aligned with the actual texture of existence. And once you've seen this possibility, once you've tasted authentic presence, the old ways of being lose their appeal. Not because they're wrong for everyone, but because they're wrong for you. The withdrawal isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different story. A story where meaning is created rather than inherited, where connection is chosen rather than automatic, where presence replaces performance, where consciousness, despite its difficulties, is valued more than comfort. This story won't appeal to everyone. It doesn't need to. It only needs to be true for those living it. And so the mindful person continues their careful retreat from the machinery of collective life, not in judgment of those who remain engaged, not in superiority or contempt, but in simple recognition that their path must be different. They understand that what works for the many may not work for them, that the cost of participation for them exceeds its benefits, that the price of authenticity, though high, is less than the price of perpetual performance. In the end, the mindful person is learning something essential. That withdrawal isn't about running away. It's about moving toward authenticity, toward consciousness, toward a way of being that honors the full complexity of existence, rather than simplifying it into manageable but false narratives. They're learning that you can't live deeply and easily simultaneously. That consciousness demands courage. That authenticity requires standing alone, even in a crowd. And perhaps most importantly, they're learning that this is okay. That a life of questioning, uncertainty, and deliberate withdrawal from collective illusion isn't a failed life. It's simply a different life. One that prioritizes inner truth over outer success, depth over breadth, quality over quantity, presence over performance. The world will continue its frantic dance. The collective will continue its distracted rush toward destinations no one has truly chosen. And the mindful person will continue their withdrawal, creating space for something else, something quieter, something truer, something that emerges not from external demands, but from the deep, often uncomfortable territory of authentic being. This is their gift to the world, not participation in its delusions, but the quiet insistence that another way is possible. That consciousness, despite its challenges, has value. That depth, despite its difficulty, enriches existence. That withdrawal, despite its loneliness, may be the first step toward genuine presence. And maybe, just maybe, their example will reach others who are also feeling the pull to step back, to question, to seek authenticity in an inauthentic world. Not to create a movement or a manifesto, but simply to show that this path exists. That you're not crazy for seeing what you see. That you're not alone in your awareness. That the withdrawal you feel isn't weakness, but the beginning of something essential, the beginning of living as yourself, fully, consciously, authentically, whatever the cost. The mindful person learns something else through their withdrawal. They learn about cycles. That consciousness isn't a linear journey from darkness to light, but a spiral that circles through the same territories at different levels of depth. There will be periods of clarity followed by periods of confusion, moments of connection followed by seasons of solitude, times when authentic living feels natural and times when it feels impossible. This is not failure. This is the rhythm of conscious existence. Understanding these cycles brings patience. The mindful person stops expecting themselves to maintain constant awareness, perpetual authenticity, unbroken presence. They accept that consciousness waxes and wanes like everything else in existence. What matters is not perfection but direction. Not never falling asleep but continuing to wake up. Not eliminating all inauthenticity but recognizing it more quickly each time it appears. This patience extends to their relationship with the world. They stop expecting society to change to accommodate their awareness. They stop waiting for others to validate their choices. They stop hoping that someday their withdrawal will be understood and appreciated. They accept that they may always be somewhat out of step with the dominant rhythm, always slightly marginal, always engaged in the difficult work of creating meaning in a world that offers primarily distraction. And in this acceptance, something beautiful emerges, a kind of peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of having made friends with existence on its own terms. The mindful person discovers that they can be at home in themselves even when homeless in the world. that they can maintain their center even when nothing around them reflects it, that they can choose authenticity even when it brings no reward beyond the integrity of the choice itself. This is the ultimate gift of withdrawal. Not escape from difficulty, but the strength to meet difficulty from a place of groundedness. Not the elimination of challenges, but the capacity to face challenges without losing yourself in them. Not a life without pain, but a life where pain is no longer avoided at the cost of consciousness. The mindful person learns to prefer genuine struggle to comfortable illusion, authentic uncertainty to false certainty, real questions to easy answers. Because in the end, Heidegger was right. We are beings who must create our meaning in a world that offers no predetermined significance. And the mindful person, in their withdrawal, is engaged in exactly this creation. Not avoiding the question of existence, but finally, courageously, beginning to answer it with their actual lives. Not seeking to escape the burden of freedom, but learning to carry it with grace. Not running from the anxiety of being, but transforming that anxiety into the fuel for authentic existence. The withdrawal continues, not as a fixed state, but as an ongoing practice. The mindful person keeps creating space for consciousness in a world designed to prevent it, keeps choosing depth in a culture of surfaces, keeps honoring truth in an empire of appearances. And in doing so, they keep alive the possibility that human existence can be more than automated response to external stimuli. That we can be more than what the world tells us we should be. That consciousness, despite everything, remains possible. This is their quiet revolution, not fought with arguments or manifestos, but lived through each conscious choice, each authentic moment, each refusal to surrender awareness for comfort. And perhaps this is the most powerful form of resistance available to us. Not the resistance of opposition, but the resistance of alternative existence. Not fighting against the world, but creating small pockets of different world within this one. Pockets where consciousness dwells, where authenticity breathes, where being human means something more than playing assigned roles in someone else's script.